Etherhold Station turned slowly above a planet that had no name anymore. The world below had once been called something beautiful in 3 different languages, but every species that remembered those words was extinct, and so the planet had simply been catalogued, scorched, and forgotten. It made for a fitting view. 47 empires had agreed long ago that diplomacy worked best when everyone could see what failure looked like through the window. The station itself was a cathedral of glass and quiet alloys, its corridors built wide enough for the largest known species and tall enough for the proudest. Light moved through it in slow, deliberate currents, filtered through panels designed to soothe nervous systems no human had ever evolved to share. Etherhold did not feel like a building. It felt like a held breath. In the lower observation deck, where the carpets were thick enough to swallow footsteps and the chairs were arranged in careful, non-confrontational arcs, an old man sat alone. Marcus Hale was 63 standard years old, though anyone looking at him would have guessed 80. His uniform was the soft gray of a logistical aide, 3rd tier, non-combat, the lowest rank a human was permitted to wear inside Etherhold's diplomatic wing. His hair had gone white in uneven patches, the way hair goes when stress chews it from the inside. A long scar curved from his left ear to the corner of his mouth, pale and clean, the kind of wound that had been stitched by a field medic who had run out of anesthetic and apologized about it later. He held a cup of water in both hands. He had been holding it for 40 minutes. He had not taken a sip. Around him, the station hummed with its usual choreography. Veshtari diplomats glided past in their long ceremonial robes, six-limbed and gentle-eyed. A pair of Koran warriors stood at parade rest near the far wall, their armored crests dimmed to indicate non-aggression. A Thaleshi envoy floated by in a translucent containment sphere, murmuring to an aide in a language that sounded like wind chimes drowning. None of them looked at Marcus. All of them were aware of exactly where he was. This was the way of things in the 18th year of the long, uneasy ceasefire. Humans were tolerated on Etherhold because no treaty could function without them. They were placed in low ranks because no species, not even the Koran, wanted to admit how badly the human wars had gone for everyone involved. The official records called it the Bramble Conflict, a tidy word for something that had cost the galaxy 900 million lives across 2 decades, and ended, inexplicably, with humanity still standing on every world it had ever bled for. The galaxy had learned in those 20 years that humans did not behave like other species. They did not surrender when surrender was rational. They did not retreat when retreat was survivable. They did not stop when stopping was wise. And worst of all, most terrifying of all, they did not seem to celebrate when they won. They simply went quiet, the way Marcus was quiet now. A soft chime moved through the observation deck. The light shifted from pale gold to pale silver, marking the changing of the diplomatic shift. Ambassadors drifted toward the upper levels. The Koran guards rotated out. For a brief moment, the lower observation deck was nearly empty. Marcus closed his eyes. He did not see the small figure step through the archway behind him. He did not see her pause, her 3-fingered hand resting against the doorframe, her wide pale eyes fixing on the back of his head with the absolute, unblinking focus that only children can produce. He did not see her glance once over her shoulder to check that her guardians were still arguing 2 corridors away. He did not see her take her first careful, curious step toward the human who, in every story she had ever been told, was either a monster or a god. The station's ambient archive, a passive recording system woven into every wall of Etherhold, agreed upon by all 47 empires for the sake of transparency, registered her movement and began, quietly, to listen. Neither of them knew it yet. But the galaxy was about to change in the next 11 minutes. Her name was Ira Veshtalun, and she was 7 cycles old, which made her roughly the equivalent of a human child of 9. Her skin was the soft lavender of her mother's house, marked along the cheekbones with the pale silver striations that all Veshtari children carried until adolescence. She wore the formal half-robe of a diplomatic daughter, hemmed in the colors of her clan, and she had 3 thin braids gathered at the nape of her neck, because her father had not yet learned how to do the 4th one properly without her mother's help. Her mother was 3 corridors away, in a closed meeting with the Koran trade attaché. Her father was on the other side of the station, smoothing over a small incident involving a Thaleshi delegate and a misunderstood gesture. Her 2 assigned guardians were arguing in low, embarrassed voices about whose turn it had been to watch her. Yaira had not run away exactly. She had simply walked, the way curious children walk, in the direction of the thing she most wanted to see. She had been told about humans her entire life. Her grandmother, who had lived through the Bramble conflict, told stories in the old way, soft-voiced, by the cook fire, with her 3 eyes half closed. In those stories, humans were not described. They were suggested. The shape of a footprint in ash, the sound of a transmission cutting out mid-word, the way certain old soldiers refused to speak of them at all, and the way other old soldiers could not stop. Her tutor, who was younger and prouder, described them in lectures: bipedal, carbon-based, disproportionately durable for their mass, psychologically aberrant, statistically inexplicable. He used the word anomaly the way other species use the word prayer. Her schoolmates whispered about them on the playground. They said humans could not be killed properly. They said humans laughed in the wrong places. They said if you ever met one, you should be polite and quiet and small, and you should never, ever ask them about the war. Yaira had decided some time ago that she did not believe any of it. She believed in seeing things for herself. The old human had not noticed her yet. He was sitting very still, the way her grandfather sat when his joints hurt and he did not want anyone to know. His hands were wrapped around a cup, and the cup was not steaming, and his eyes were closed, and his face looked to her like the face of someone who was listening to something very far away. She took another step. The thick carpet ate the sound. She took another. She was 4 paces from him when one of the Koran guards at the far wall noticed her. The guard's crest flared just slightly, the warrior equivalent of a sharp inhale. His hand drifted toward the compad at his hip, then stopped. Protocol was unclear. The child was Veshtari, not human. The human was unarmed, low-ranking, and had not moved. Any action taken now would be recorded by the ambient archive, reviewed by the council, and dissected by 47 separate intelligence bureaus by morning. The Koran guard did the only thing his training allowed. He stood very, very still and he watched. Across the deck, a Thaleshi envoy in her translucent sphere noticed next. Then a passing Veshtari aide who froze in the doorway with a stack of data slates pressed to her chest. Then a Koran sniper in the architectural overlook, 3 levels up, who had been assigned to the room as a matter of routine and now found his scope drifting, almost against his will, toward the child. Within 90 seconds, 22 pairs of eyes were fixed on the lower observation deck, and not one of them dared to breathe loudly enough to break the spell. Yaira stopped a single pace from Marcus Hale's chair. She studied him with the grave, unhurried attention of a child examining a new kind of stone. She tilted her head. She looked at the scar on his face. She looked at the patches of white in his hair. She looked at his hands, which were rough and steady and freckled in places where Veshtari hands did not freckle. Marcus opened his eyes. He did not startle. He did not smile exactly. He simply looked at her, the way one looks at something one has been expecting for a long time without knowing it. "Hello," he said. His voice was lower than she had imagined, softer. Yaira's 3 braids swung as she straightened. She took a breath that was, for a Veshtari child, the bravest breath of her life. "Are you really a human?" she asked. And somewhere in the walls, the ambient archive of Etherhold Station, which had been listening to 47 empires lie to each other for 18 years, began to record something it had never heard before. "Yes," Marcus said, "I'm really a human." Yaira considered this with the seriousness of a small judge. She seemed to be checking the answer against everything she had been told, and finding that the answers did not match, and deciding that the human in front of her was the more reliable source. "You don't look like a monster," she said. "No," Marcus agreed, "I don't think I do. My tutor said you would. Your tutor has probably never met one of us." Yaira nodded slowly. This was the kind of answer that satisfied her. She glanced once at the chair beside him, a polite, questioning glance, and Marcus tilted his head a fraction of an inch, which she understood. She climbed up into the chair, smoothed her robe over her knees the way her mother had taught her, and folded her hands in her lap. In the upper architectural overlook, the Koran sniper lowered his scope. He could not have explained later why he did. "May I ask you questions?" Yaira said. "You may. Even the ones nobody is supposed to ask." Marcus was quiet for a long moment. Then slowly something at the corner of his mouth moved. It was not quite a smile. It was the place where a smile would have lived if smiles still came easily to him. "Especially those," he said. Yaira exhaled. She had not realized she had been holding her breath. She started with small questions, because she was a careful child and she understood that some doors had to be opened gently. She asked him what his name was. She asked him how old he was. She asked him whether humans really had only 2 eyes, and whether it was true that they slept lying down, and whether the stories about humans laughing during funerals were stories or whether they were true. Marcus answered all of them. His name was Marcus. He was 63. Yes, 2 eyes. Yes, lying down. As for the funerals, humans laughed sometimes, he said, because crying for too long was a thing that broke people, and laughter was the rope they threw each other to climb back out. Yaira wrote this down in her head. She would remember it for the rest of her life. In the walls, the archive listened. The questions grew braver. She asked him if he had been in the war. He said yes. She asked him what he had done in the war. He was quiet for a while, and then he said he had been a soldier and then a sergeant and then, near the end, a man who was sent to places where soldiers had stopped being useful. He did not elaborate. He did not need to. Yaira knew somehow not to push. Instead, she asked him about his family. Marcus's hands tightened, very slightly on the cup. He had a wife once, he told her. Her name had been Alina. She had liked the rain. He had a daughter once, too. Her name had been Myra. She had been 7 years old the last time he had held her, which he noted softly was about Yaira's age. He had been deployed when the colony she lived on was attacked. He had not been there. He had not come home in time. He had not in many ways come home at all. Yaira's eyes filled with the soft pale gold that, in Veshtari children, was the color of grief borrowed from someone else. "I am sorry," she whispered. "I am very, very sorry." "I know," Marcus said. "Thank you." A long, careful quiet settled between them. In the overlook, the Koran sniper had set his rifle down entirely. In her sphere, the Thaleshi envoy had stopped murmuring. The Veshtari aide in the doorway was crying soundlessly into the stack of data slates pressed against her chest, and had not yet realized she was. The archive recorded all of it. Yaira gathered herself. She had one more question. It was the question she had walked across 3 corridors to ask. It was the question her grandmother had never answered, and her tutor had refused to answer, and her schoolmates had only whispered about. It was the question every empire in the galaxy had asked, in war rooms and council chambers and the back of every diplomat's mind, for 18 long and frightened years. She looked up at Marcus Hale with her wide, pale eyes, and she asked it. "Why," she said, "do humans never lose?" In the walls, the ambient archive of Etherhold Station registered the question, tagged it, time-stamped it, and held very, very still. Marcus Hale set down his cup. For a long moment, Marcus did not speak. He looked at the child beside him and then through her, the way a man looks through a window at something only he can see. The scar at the corner of his mouth caught the silver light and held it. Somewhere on the upper levels, a chime marked the half-shift. No one moved. When he finally spoke, his voice was not louder than it had been before. If anything, it was softer. But it carried in the way that certain truths carry, not by volume, but by the weight they push against the air. "Yaira," he said, "do you know what the other empires think about us?" She nodded slowly. "They think you cannot be beaten." "That's the conclusion," he said. "Yes, but it's the wrong question." "What is the right question?" "The right question," Marcus said, "is what we lost before the war ever started." He turned the cup slowly between his palms. The water inside it did not spill. His hands were that steady. "When the Koran came for us," he said, "they didn't come for soldiers, they came for cities, they came for hospitals, they came for the schools where our children were learning to read. By the time the first human battalion was raised, every man and woman in it had already buried someone. Most of us had buried everyone. There was no home left to defend. There was no future left to protect. There were only the people standing next to us, and the dirt we were standing on, and whatever was coming next." He paused. His eyes were very far away. "Other species fight to win," he said. "They fight because winning gives them something. A border, a tribute, a throne, a story to tell their grandchildren. They fight because they have something to keep and they're afraid of losing it." He looked down at Yaira. His voice did not break, it only got quieter. "We don't fight to win," he said. "We fight because we already accepted losing everything. We lost it before the first shot. We lost it when they took our homes. We lost it when they took our children. We lost it when they made us into the kind of people who could keep walking after that." He set the cup down on the small table between them. The sound it made was very small. "When you have nothing left to fear," he said, "you don't lose, you can't. Losing is what happens to people who still have something they're trying to hold on to. We let go a long time ago. That's the whole secret. That's the only secret. There is no strategy. There is no weapon. There is no special quality in our blood. There is only the fact that, somewhere along the way, the universe took everything from us that could be used as a leash. And then it pointed us at the people who had done the taking, and it was surprised when we didn't stop." He was quiet for a moment. "We're not strong," he said. "We're just finished. And a finished man is the most dangerous thing in any galaxy because there's nothing left in him that can be threatened. You can kill him, but you can't beat him. He's already been beaten and he kept walking anyway." He looked at her then, really looked at her, not through her. And something in his face softened in a way that no one on Etherhold had ever seen a human face soften before. "That's why we never lose, little one," he said. "Not because we're great, because we're tired. And because, somewhere in the tired, we found something the rest of you never had to look for. I hope you never have to look for it. I hope none of your children ever have to look for it. That's the only thing I want in all the rest of my life. That nobody else has to learn what we learned." He picked up the cup again. He took at last a sip of water. In the walls, the ambient archive of Etherhold Station processed the audio file, ran it against its priority protocols, and flagged it instantly. A pale line of text rippled across its internal log, visible to no one in the room and to almost everyone, very soon in the galaxy. Priority distribution, CIVILIZATIONAL. Release immediate. RECIPIENTS, all. The recording left Etherhold Station at the speed of light, and then, through the relay network, at speeds that physics had stopped arguing about 3 centuries ago. It reached the Veshtari Inner Council first, because the station's archive prioritized the home empire of the child involved. The council was in the middle of a budget dispute. The audio began to play through the chamber's ambient speakers without warning, because the priority flag overrode every protocol the Veshtari had ever written. By the time Marcus's voice said we fight because we already accepted losing everything, the budget dispute was over. No one ever finished that sentence again. It reached the Koran High War Hall second. The Koran did not have a council, they had a war hall. And the war hall was, at that moment, reviewing the latest containment models for the human sector. The audio cut through the briefing like a knife through cloth. The general overseeing the review, a decorated veteran of the Bramble conflict, a being who had personally ordered the bombardment of 3 human colonies, listened to the entire recording without moving. When it ended, he stood up. He walked out of the war hall. He went to his private quarters. He did not come out for 2 days. It reached the Thaleshi Concord. It reached the Drenok hegemony. It reached the Vol Spires, the Asari Federation, the Mirror Court of Halun, the floating city-states of the Braille, the predator kingdoms of the Outer Drift. It reached 47 empires in the space of a single rotation, and in each of them the same thing happened, with only slight variations. Conversation stopped. Then very slowly, conversation started again, in lower voices and about different things. In the war rooms of the Drenok hegemony, 3 admirals who had been planning a probing strike against the human-aligned trade lanes quietly canceled the operation without telling each other why. In the Mirror Court of Halun, a young queen who had been raised on stories of human savagery listened to the recording 4 times alone, and then asked her ministers, in a voice none of them had ever heard from her, whether it was too late to recall a particular fleet. Her ministers said it was not. The fleet came home. On the predator worlds of the Outer Drift, where philosophy was generally considered a weakness and mercy was considered a kind of disease, the recording was banned within 6 hours of its arrival. It was, of course, the most shared piece of audio in the drift within 12. There is something about the truth, when it is spoken softly by a tired man to a small child, that gets past the doors of even the hardest houses. Aboard merchant ships in deep space, traders who had never thought much about the war played the recording over the comm channels just to hear another voice. Mining colonies on the rim played it through the loudspeakers during shift change. School teachers, in 17 languages on 12 different worlds, found themselves explaining it to children who were not yet old enough to understand it but who would understand it later, when their own lives demanded the explanation. The recording had no title. The archive had not given it one. People began to call it different things in different places. The Hale recording, the Etherhold address, the tired man, the quiet answer. In Veshtari schools 2 generations later, it would simply be called the conversation, with no further explanation needed. But that was later. In the first 11 hours after release, what mattered was not the name. What mattered was that, somewhere in the Drenok hegemony, the hegemon herself, a woman who had built her entire reign on the doctrine that humans were a problem to be solved by attrition, sat alone in her private chamber and listened to the recording for the 7th time. When it ended, she pressed a single key on the console beside her, and she summoned her chief diplomat. "Open a channel," she said, "to the human envoy, to the Veshtari Council, to anyone who will listen." The chief diplomat, who had served her for 30 years, hesitated. "To say what, Highness?" The hegemon looked at the wall. Her eyes were very tired. "To sue for peace," she said, "tonight, before sunrise on any of our worlds, before we make this any worse than we already have." The diplomat bowed. He did not ask why. He had heard the recording too. By the end of the first rotation, 3 empires had formally requested peace. The Drenok hegemony came first, exactly as the hegemon had ordered. Their request arrived at Etherhold through the proper channels, signed in the hegemon's own hand, citing a desire for reassessment of long-standing strategic assumptions. Diplomatic language. Everyone who read it understood what it meant. The Mirror Court of Halun came second. The young queen did not bother with diplomatic language. Her message was 4 sentences long. It said that the Mirror Court would be withdrawing its forward fleets, releasing its human prisoners, and opening its border worlds to inspection. It said that any prior aggression by Halun was, in retrospect, a failure of imagination on our part, not a failure of courage on theirs. It was not signed by a minister. It was signed by the Queen herself, in red ink, which in Halun meant the writer accepted personal responsibility for every word. The third was the strangest. The Asari Federation, which had never officially been at war with humanity but had spent 18 years funding nearly every empire that was, sent a delegation in person. They arrived at Etherhold within 16 hours of the recording's release, which meant they must have boarded their transport before the recording had even finished traveling. The lead Asari diplomat, a small, pale, careful being with 6 fingers and 1 milky eye, walked into the council chamber, bowed deeply to the human ambassador, and said only, "We did not understand. We understand now. We would like to stop." The human ambassador, a sharp woman named Hessa Round, who had survived the Bramble conflict as a teenager, and who had never in her life expected to see a Asari bow to anything, accepted on behalf of her people with as much grace as she could find. She then excused herself to the bathroom and wept for 11 minutes. Meanwhile, on the lower observation deck of Etherhold Station, Marcus Hale was being summoned before the Joint Council. He did not know why. He had not been told about the recording. He had not been told about the 3 empires. He had not been told that, somewhere on the station, his daughter, no, not his daughter, he had to keep reminding himself, the Veshtari child, the small one, Yaira, had been gently returned to her parents, who had not scolded her, because they had been listening to the recording in the corridor outside the council chamber when she was brought in, and they could not, after hearing it, find any part of themselves that wanted to be angry. Marcus walked the long corridor to the council chamber the way he walked everywhere, slowly, quietly, with the careful, deliberate gait of a man who had learned, in another life, that hurrying drew fire. The chamber doors opened for him. 47 ambassadors stood when he entered. Marcus stopped in the doorway. He looked around the room. He counted, out of habit, the angles of approach, the exits, the cover. Then he remembered that he was 63 years old and that no one in the room was going to shoot him, and he allowed his shoulders, very slightly, to come down. The chairman of the council, a tall, silver-furred Sethari named Val Anner, who had presided over Etherhold for 9 years and who had developed in that time a face that could not be read by any species in the galaxy, looked at him for a long moment. When Val Anner finally spoke, his voice was unsteady in a way it had never been before. "Sergeant Hale," he said, "we have called you here because 3 empires have, in the past 16 hours, sued for peace. They have done so on the basis of a recording made earlier today in the lower observation deck of this station, between yourself and a Veshtari child." Marcus said nothing. "We are not certain," Val Anner continued, "whether the proper response of this council is to commend you, to detain you, or to ask you a question." Marcus considered this. "What's the question?" he said. Val Anner's hands trembled very slightly on the rail of the dais. He had presided over wars. He had presided over treaties. He had never in his life presided over a moment quite like this one. He drew a long breath. "Did you know," he said, "that the archive was recording?" The chamber held its breath. Marcus looked at the chairman. He looked for a moment, very tired and very old and very far away. And then he answered. "No," Marcus said, "I didn't." The chamber exhaled. 47 ambassadors in 47 different ways released the breath they had been holding. "But," Marcus added, "I don't think it would have changed what I said." Val Anner studied him for a long moment. Then slowly, the silver-furred Sethari did something no chairman of the Joint Council had ever done in the 18-year history of Etherhold Station. He stepped down from the dais. He crossed the chamber floor. He stopped in front of Marcus Hale, a low-ranking human logistical aide in a soft gray uniform, and he inclined his head not deeply, not ceremonially, but in the small, honest way that one tired old man inclines his head to another. "Thank you, Sergeant," he said. Marcus did not know what to do with that. He had never been thanked in any formal way for anything he had done in the war or after it. He stood very still. And after a moment, he inclined his head back. It was the only language he had left for the moment. The chamber adjourned without a vote. There was nothing to vote on. In the weeks that followed, the galaxy did not become a paradise. 3 empires had sued for peace, but 44 had not. There were still skirmishes on the rim. There were still old grudges burning in old places. The outer drift remained the outer drift. The recording did not fix the galaxy. But it changed it. Trade routes that had been closed for a decade reopened. Prisoner exchanges, long stalled, suddenly resolved. Border patrols on 12 different frontiers were quietly reduced. Across the galaxy, in war rooms and council chambers and back-alley philosophy halls, a new question began to be asked in many languages. What are we actually fighting for? It was a question that, once asked, was very difficult to unask. Many regimes did not survive it. Marcus Hale was offered things. He was offered titles: Hero of the Ceasefire, Voice of the Reconciliation, Honorary Citizen of 19 separate worlds. He was offered ships named after him. He was offered a seat on the Joint Council itself, a position no human had ever held. He was offered, by the Mirror Court of Halloon, a small estate on a warm planet with a view of 2 suns. He refused all of it. He asked instead to go home. Home, for Marcus, was a small farm in the hills above a town called Cresswell, on a world that the Bramble conflict had spared by pure accident of geography. He had not been back to it in 40 years. The farmhouse was still there. The roof needed work. The fields had gone to long grass. The graves of his wife Eleanor and his daughter Myra were on the rise behind the house, beneath a tree that had grown taller than he remembered. He stood in front of those graves for a long time, on the first evening after he returned. He did not speak. He did not need to. He simply set down his bag, and he stayed. In the years that followed, he kept goats. He fixed the roof. He learned slowly how to be a man in a place where no one was shooting at him. He received letters from across the galaxy, thousands of them, from species he had never met, in languages his translator software struggled with. He read them all. He answered very few. The ones he did answer, he answered briefly in his careful, quiet hand. One letter every year came from Ira Veshtalun. She grew up. She became a diplomat herself in time, and then a scholar, and then, much later, a teacher. She had children of her own. She told them the story when they were old enough. They told it to their children, and their children told it to theirs. The recording continued to play. It became, in time, the most listened to audio file in galactic history. It was taught in schools on 600 worlds. It was quoted in treaties, etched into monuments, whispered between soldiers before deployments that, mercifully, became rarer with each passing decade. Whole philosophies were built on it. Whole religions revised themselves around it. But for most listeners, in most places, what remained was not the philosophy. What remained was the moment near the end, when a tired old man set down his cup and said, very softly, to a child he had never met before, "We're not strong. We're just finished. And a finished man is the most dangerous thing in any galaxy, because there's nothing left in him that can be threatened." And then, more softly still, "I hope you never have to look for it." On the hill above Cresswell, beneath a tree that had grown taller than he remembered, Marcus Hale lived out his last years in the quiet he had bought for the galaxy by accident. The galaxy, in turn, did its best to deserve it.